Clerk will call the roll. Mr. Alexander.
Republicans and Democrats have spent all afternoon taking turns speaking about the debt limit and the government shutdown. We saw something unusual in the Senate this afternoon. That was all of the senators sitting in their seats. The Majority Leader Harry Reid called the members to the floor in a live quorum. Then Senator Reid spoke, mentioning a lot of different topics. But the main announcement was that he's planning to introduce a bill to allow the nation's borrowing limit to be extended.
Thank you, Madam President. Most of us in the Senate have read at least something about our nation's founding, and though it's striking, what is almost always overlooked is the founders' use of the language of the Republic. Asked by a citizen on the street which was being created behind closed doors in Philadelphia, a republic or a monarchy, Benjamin Franklin famously said, "A republic, if you can keep it." As with most foundational decisions, the founders made this choice deliberately. The idea of democracy frightened Hamilton, Adams, and others because they equated it with mobs in the streets. They worried that mob rule would overcome rights bestowed not by their government, but by their creator. They studied the classics, and their models were the Greek and Roman republics. And they set out to do something never done before, to create a republic of the scope and scale never before attempted, and one that could expand as the country grew. Today, we are the world's oldest and greatest democracy. And during the last century, America has expanded the constitutional rights to women and people of color well beyond land-owning white men originally privileged. In our time, we've come to understand that democracies are about the rights of citizens. But a republic, the founders understood, is about the duties of citizens, the obligations a citizen has to a society whose Constitution guarantees his or her rights. Basic duties are to pay taxes levied by a representative government, to defend our country when called upon, and to obey the law. Our founders had something even greater in mind, qualities that would make a republic endure. Like republics from ancient Athens forward, they believed in popular sovereignty based on citizen participation in government. They believed in the Commonwealth, all those things we hold in value in common, like our defense and our shared infrastructure and the welfare of the next generation of Americans. They believed in putting the common interest above personal or narrow interests, a sense of the national interest. How else could committed slave owners and abolitionists form a country and a government? And they believed in resistance to corruption, those who would turn the national interest to personal gain. We were founded as a republic, and we have become more democratic across time. We are democratic and Republican. Interestingly enough, what came to be the semblance of the first political party in America called itself the Democratic Republicans. It was founded in 1791. Sounds pretty weird today, I know, but it simply meant those who believed in democratic equality and freedom working to uphold the ideals of the Republic. One of our bedrock American principles is that we must protect our rights through performance of our duties, and that is not some abstract political theory. This is a definition of who we are and how we must govern ourselves. We have rights and responsibilities as citizens and as senators. We have the right to free speech, but the responsibility not to shout fire in a crowded theater. We have the right to assemble, but the responsibility to do so peacefully. And in this body, we have the right to filibuster, but the responsibility to govern on behalf of the American people. But the fewer the Americans who exercise the most fundamental right, I would say duty, of voting, the more political influence extreme groups in our society have. This is where we find ourselves at the dawn of the 21st century, with a Senate that at times is dominated by a small faction that does not represent the mainstream of American political thought, and a House that's gerrymandered into dysfunction. This institutional paralysis has created a vacuum into which a million special interests happily roam. Actually, Madam President, I should call them narrow, not special interests. And from ancient Athens onward, narrow interests have been the enemy of every republic, and that's never been truer than it is today. Keeping the republic created by our founders should concern every generation of Americans, including our own. The sovereign power belongs to all the people, not just a vocal few. And it's our responsibility, it's our duty as elected officials, when that ideal is tested, to work together to restore a sense of the Commonwealth and the common good that enabled us to prevail in world wars and to overcome depressions. This is our cause, Madam President, but we are stuck. We're stuck because we're fighting over yesterday's battles instead of seeking to anticipate, as our founders did, how we will manage change. To one degree or another, all senators and possibly all Americans are conservative. If conservative means to protect our nation's principles and ideals, I'm a conservative. If conservative means to preserve a culture of tolerance, justice, and equality, I'm a conservative. If conservative means to respect the unique cultural heritage of America, I'm a conservative. If conservative means to protect our natural heritage, I'm very much a conservative. But while we protect and preserve the best of what makes us who we are, we must adapt to change. Scarcely one of us in the Senate has ever sought office without advocating some kind of change, change of office holder, change of party, change of policy. And that's good, because the future is arriving faster and faster, and we've gotten no better at anticipating it. Even with the seemingly endless crawl of the words breaking news at the bottom of our screens, no one predicted the Arab Spring before it sprung. And that's the most closely watched region in the world. There are great historic ties that demand that we change and adapt to them in order to preserve and protect and conserve our central values. We don't live in a stagnant world. Indeed, we're living in the midst of great revolution that makes the 21st century as different from the 20th as the 18th century was from the 17th. We're living through what may be the peak years of change on the scale of the Industrial Revolution. But even though we may come here oriented to change, the institutions of government, Congress included, are oriented to the past. Our committee structure and our regulatory agencies. Imagine an economy that existed deep in the last century. We're designed to support incumbent interests, not the innovators that will drive job growth and wage growth in the 21st century. This is a fatal flaw if we are ever going to tackle the growing income inequality that our nation faces, an inequality that has been unmatched since 1928. We're regulating the telegraph when the world is wireless. Just one example, almost a year ago, I visited Apple out in Silicon Valley to learn something about their work in education. A little over 4 years ago, when I was superintendent of Denver Public Schools, I didn't spend 1 second thinking about how to apply a tablet to the education of our kids, because there was no such thing as a tablet a little over 4 years ago. Today, the tablet, combined with platforms like the iTunes platform, presents an unbelievable opportunity for our children and children all around the world to learn and to teach each other. It was really amazing to see. In any case, Apple presented a slide showing that 75% of their last 12 months of revenue was derived from products they did not sell 5 years before. 75% of their revenue came from things they did not sell 5 years before. And we haven't updated our tax code since 1986. I was in college in 1986. What are the chances that our tax code is helping drive job and wage growth in 2013, 27 years later, more than a quarter of a century later? In this Congress and in this government, we are desperately out of sync with the world as it is. It is, in fact, an irony that we must change and adapt to preserve the principles that we treasure, but we must. Today, many flying the Tea Party banner resist all change. Indeed, they want to go back, often to a past that never existed or to a time that has no relation to our time. And too often, their politics embraces old interests that will not drive us forward to an economy that is creating jobs and raising wages. Our founding principles should not change, and I agree with that. But our practices and methods must change or to become relevant. These two parties, or three with the Tea Party, have to escape their orthodoxies for this to be possible. Efforts to maintain the status quo or to return to some mythical past are doomed to fail. That is simply because time and the tides of human affairs will not stand still. We do not control history and cannot dictate to it. Change is the one constant, and how we attempt to shape it to our purposes by creative, imaginative public policies will determine whether we can preserve the best of our past, our principles, our heritage, and our values. Those who seek to protect our nation against change by sitting on the beach before a massive incoming tide with shovel in hand will be swept away as surely as King Canute. And as I mentioned earlier, anyone who believes their orthodoxy or their ideological orientation prepared them for the Arab Spring or made us safer is deluded. Our job must be to create a shared understanding of the facts in a town that's arranged to obscure them. And despite the desires of nostalgia, we're not going back to the laissez-faire world of Herbert Hoover. Social safety nets are here to stay to protect children, the elderly, the poor, the disabled, and to protect our ability to call ourselves a civilized nation. But even they will have to be changed if they're going to survive for the next generation of Americans. The revolution of globalization and information have transformed the world's economy and cultures and societies all across the globe, including here in the United States. These revolutions, like the Industrial Revolution before them, cannot be stopped, and it is up to us to decide. It's up to us to decide whether we can accept this new reality and position our country to lead as it has since our founding, or whether we shrink into an imaginary conception of what the world once was and what the United States once was. With all this change and pace of globalization comes fear of the future and a sense of loss of what once was. That's human nature, and I don't exempt myself from that. And in a time of uncertainty, it's become fashionable in some political circles to capitalize on it politically. This kind of demagoguery is not unknown in American history. Any time Americans become fearful or worried, there have always been those who saw personal advantage in fanning those flames. But they do not join an honor roll of history, an assembly of our greatest leaders. Media attention, which is easy and cheap, is not a measure of leadership. Division does not require moral authority. And if we are at another of history's turning points, as many believe, as I believe, one road leads to the worst of our past. The other road leads to a new definition of our freedoms. We treasure the freedoms incorporated in the First Amendment to our Constitution. We remember at the height of the Great Depression that Franklin Roosevelt declared 4 new freedoms: freedom of speech and worship and freedom from want and fear. Today, in the middle of what one might characterize as a political depression, Let's consider some new freedoms for the 21st century. Freedom from foreign oil, freedom from false patriotism, freedom from the politics of division, freedom to create a constructive future, and yes, freedom from unconstitutional government surveillance. We have duties to perform far greater than merely funding the government. Just ask any poor child or her teacher in a typical American school. The good news is that fear has never and will not now dictate the fate of our republic. History's dustbin is filled with failed demagogues, and we are not going back. But we need to hurry. The world is not waiting for us. Americans want us to move forward into the 21st century with the imagination, creativity, adaptability, and values that have made this country so great from its founding. The stakes are simply too high in our time to allow our institutions to be crippled by politicians who color far outside the lines of conventional American political thought and who react with anger and mock surprise when their policy objectives are not achieved. It's time to close this sorry chapter in the history of the Congress, reopen our government, preserve the full faith and credit of the United States, and work together as senators from the various states on the people's business. I suspect that's why most of us wanted to serve to begin with. Thank you, Madam President. I yield the floor. And I suggest the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll. Mr. Alexander.
House Speaker John Boehner held a briefing this afternoon about the government shutdown. Emily Pierce of Roll Call sent a tweet about the briefing, quoting Speaker Boehner, saying the long and short of it is there's going to be a negotiation here. Another quote from Mr. Boehner, tweeted by David Drucker with the D.C. Examiner, Obama is asking for unconditional surrender, and that's not how this works. Speaker Boehner held the briefing in response to President Obama's more than hour-long press conference this afternoon, the first since the government shutdown. President Obama said he would accept a short-term deal to reopen the government and raise the debt ceiling, but indicated the deal would have to be a clean bill to raise the borrowing limit and fund the government. You can see President Obama's remarks at 8 Eastern tonight here on C-SPAN 2 if the Senate is out. The House is in session this evening, working on a measure that would create a committee to address the current fiscal impasse, and also another proposal to pay essential federal employees who are working during the shutdown. The White House is threatening to veto that Republican proposal creating the committee. And a final vote on those measures is expected shortly with our live coverage on C-SPAN. And earlier this afternoon, the House passed its 10th short-term resolution funding a small part of the government, that one for the Head Start education program. It's the 8th day of the government shutdown, and today Senator Cruz and Majority Leader Reid talked about that.
Mr. President, I want to again thank the Majority Leader for bringing to the attention of this body the tragedy of those servicemen who lost their lives, and the fact that unfortunately they have been notified improperly, I believe, that they will not be, their families will not be being paid the tax-free death gratuity that they are entitled under law. This is wrong. Every member of this body agrees this is wrong. Every Republican agrees it is wrong, and I'm confident every Democrat agrees it is wrong as well. And indeed, the way this announcement was made was highly troubling. The Department of Defense notified our military families via Twitter that those service members who die in battle will not be paid their tax-free death gratuities due to the partial federal government shutdown. I think this is yet another pattern that we have seen distressingly from the Obama administration of politicizing this shutdown and playing partisan games to maximize the pain that is inflicted on Americans. It is part and parcel with the pattern we've seen barricading the World War II memorial, barricading the parking lot at Mount Vernon, George Washington's home, even though Mount Vernon is privately operated, barricading the roads leaving Mount Rushmore, even though they are state roads and not federal roads. And the actions by the Department of Defense are also contrary to the statute that this body just passed. The military death gratuity is by statute a pay and personnel benefit, and accordingly it is clearly funded by Public Law 113-39, the Pay Our Military Act that was passed in a bipartisan manner this week. We already acted to prevent this, and unfortunately the Defense Department is declining to follow that law that we passed. The legislation that this body already passed would immediately act to take the families of those soldiers and sailors and airmen and Marines whose lives are tragically taken, to take them off the table and say, regardless of what happens in a government shutdown, we're going to stand by the men and women fighting for America. And indeed, the House of Representatives has introduced a bipartisan bill to immediately fund death gratuity payments. When that bill is passed, the Senate should pass that bill immediately. Indeed, the Pentagon should abandon this policy to begin with and simply follow the law that was already passed. But if they don't, I call upon all 100 senators to come together to listen to the Majority Leader, who spoke powerfully about the need to stand by our servicemen and women who...
Mr. Leader.
I ask unanimous consent the call of the quorum be terminated.
Without objection.
I now ask consent that the Senate proceed to period of morning business. Senators allowed to speak for up to 10 minutes each during that time.
Without objection.
There are two measures at the desk. I would ask for their first readings.
The clerk will read the title of the measures for the first time.
S-1569, a bill to ensure the complete and timely payment of the obligations of the United States government until December 31st, 2014. H.J. Res. 77, making continuing appropriations for the Food and Drug Administration for fiscal year 2014 and for other purposes.
I now ask for second reading and ask that my objection appear in the record on both measures.
Objection is heard. The measures will be read for the second time at the next legislative day.
I ask unanimous consent that when the Senate completes its business today, adjourn until 10:30 a.m. tomorrow morning, Wednesday, October 9th. Following the prayer and the pledge, the morning hour be deemed expired. Journal proceedings be approved to date. The time for the two leaders be reserved for use later in the day. And that following any leader remarks, the Senate be in a period of morning business for debate only until 2 p.m. The Senators permitted to speak for up to 10 minutes each.
Without objection.
Madam President, if there's no further business to come before the Senate, I ask that it adjourn under the previous order.
The Senate stands adjourned until 10:30 a.m. tomorrow.
So the Senate's gavelled out. Members continued to come to the floor today, giving speeches on the government shutdown. Off the floor, lawmakers are exploring an idea